There we go. Hello.
Hello.
Hurrah.
Hi Rory, it's Kristen here in Inverness. I'm in a literature workshop 2 to 3 and I'm wondering if we could have multi-screen for ourselves and everyone else. Oh, wonderful.
There we go.
Thank you very much. We'll go with that. I think we can turn our own view off if that helps. If that makes it better or not.
I don't know. This is not the remote which I'm familiar with, because the one that I have says presentation on it.
Yeah.
Hello.
That's how you switch to it. Excellent. Shall we get going to think?
I think we should. And my mic's on?
Hover, but
yes.
I also. Hello everyone, thank you very much for coming along. We have a full room in Inverness. I know students, staff, first year, third year, it's brilliant. Folks out there, we've got Orkney, we've got Jim up in Fern, we've got Ian in the library across town, I think, which is delightful as well because he's teaching over there. We're delighted to have Victoria with us. It's our first proper guest lecture this term.
Am I a proper guest lecturer?
You are a proper guest lecturer. You slot into our literature workshops, which is our way of creating literature citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the kind of thing that you do that doesn't get you marks, but makes you a better person. So we think going to lectures and listening to folks and asking questions is a really good way of doing it. Victoria is here with 2 hats on, her academic hat and her creative hat.
And my black hat.
And her black hat. It's excellent. We think this will be interesting for all of you because you're all thinking about it. So particularly the third years who are now thinking about dissertations, doing a creative assessment for one of the modules they're studying. And so we're keen to hear your thoughts.
Well, my main thought at the moment actually is I've just noticed a typo in my title slide because it should be means, not mean. But never mind, we all make mistakes, I am but human. Unlikely heroes and plausible heroines, historical fiction as a means of getting academic research to a wider audience. Okay, this is a lecture I originally wrote for last December when I was invited down to the University of Leeds to talk to them, and I have tried to tiggle it about a little bit and improve it since then. But if it's if it comes across as a bit poncy, it was because I was trying to impress people in Leeds. Okay, so I will read it, and if there's anything you want to say or add at the end, then we could maybe have a few minutes discussion. Right. You may be here because you're interested in history or in literature or in historical fiction. If you are interested in history or archaeology, which is kind of where I started, it may be because, like me, at an early age, you read historical fiction. A lot of people start... Creaky table, sorry, with a microphone on it. A lot of people start off reading something like Jean Plaidy or Philippa Gregory's, the Lives and Wives of Henry VIII. Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth is a great classic. Going back to the 1950s, or Henry Treace's Viking trilogy, or coming, more recently, Francesca Simon, the author of Horrid Henry books, has written a fantastic sort of Norse gods romp. Maybe even J.R.R. Tolkien with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A lot of people start writing historical fiction because they see it as a kind of teaching mechanism, as a sort of sugar-coated way of getting a history lesson across, often to a young audience. But I think it's a great deal more than simply a medium for getting an interest in the past across to people. I think for historians, and I am basically a historian, I study the early Middle Ages, and I use just about every kind of resource that's available to me. So whether it might be graves, it might be jewellery, it might be sculpture, it might be poetry, it might be a chronicle. But that's where my academic research sits. And I think actually exploring writing fiction about that past can be a really useful research tool, not just this kind of sugar-coated pill. So I started my interest in the early medieval world when I was an undergraduate. My first term at university, you did two modules, the 19th century and Anglo-Saxon poetry. And the 19th century was basically all the huge novelists you've ever heard of, like Dickens and Trollope and the Brontes and George Eliot, and it was one a week. And it wasn't even a novel a week, it was an author a week, so you're faced with, all three Brontes counted as one. And it nearly killed me. But with the Anglo-Saxon poetry, although you had to translate it out of Anglo-Saxon, it was one poem a week. And it was just lovely, and I fell in love with the whole early medieval world through that. And I then went on to York to do a master's and then a PhD at the Centre for Medieval Studies there. My master's was on the Icelandic family sagas, which are like these 13th century novels about paganism and sacrifice and violence and sex and all sorts of wonderful things. And I looked at grief and mourning and bereavement in the Icelandic family sagas, and that was fun. And then I brought my interest in death and all things death-related back to Anglo-Saxon England and did a PhD on that, and then revamped it as a book, which came out in 2004, so it's high time I wrote another academic monograph. But that's the title, Dying and Death in Later Anglo-Saxon England, thriller minute, gripping read. And some lovely reviews, which I've just put up there to show off. Okay. Because I was very interested in death and burial and graves and what goes on in graves, I started getting very interested in what goes on above ground and what's kind of permanently visible. And what I work on now mostly is sculpture, early medieval sculpture. So, and that's my current academic project. However, over the last few years, I've been developing another related identity, and that is historical novelist. And I've published two novels so far, which are The Bone Thief and The Traitor's Pit. I helped to design the cover for Bone Thief, and then the publishers decided they didn't like it, and they went for the thing in the bottom right-hand corner, which looks like kind of, Bastard Child, the Da Vinci Code and Assassin's Creed. I'm not responsible for it, or the very unhistorical sword, which the character is peculiarly gripping by the hilt. But anyway, yeah. So Bone Thief came out in 2012 and Traitor's Pit in 2013 for Ebury Press, which is an imprint of the enormous Random House multinational. And both have sold well. They're available as audiobooks. Bone Thief, as you can see there, has been translated into German. And last year I was approached by a new publisher, Head of Zeus, both a new publisher and new to me. And they've commissioned a third novel, which is still set in the Viking Age, and I'm hoping that that will be out around this time next year. So, both Bone Thief and Traitor's Pit are set in the year 900 AD, very shortly after the death of King Alfred the Great. He's the one who famously burnt the cakes and fought the Vikings. He was King of Wessex, which is the southernmost of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, basically Kent to Cornwall, that sort of slice across the bottom. The protagonist of my two novels, and he's the unlikely hero of my title today, is a young West Saxon cleric called Wulfgar, and he has been headhunted by King Alfred's daughter, who is a very cool character called Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians. And Mercia at this period is kind of the West Midlands of England, so Warwickshire, Gloucestershire, Worcestershire, that kind of middle left-hand bit. And Wulfgar is based at her court in Gloucester as her secretary. Now, both these novels emerged directly out of my research, in fact, out of questions which I tried and failed to answer through more conventional academic methodologies. And in a few minutes' time, I'm going to look more closely about how I turned a bit of historical research into a story. But first, I want to think a little bit about the past and how we know about the past and how we think we know about the past, how we pretend to ourselves we know about the past. One of my PhD supervisors, now retired, was and still is fond of repeating, there is no such thing as a historical fact. And of course he's right. You know, there are sources, and sources are not they're not facts. They're not like, it's not like, you know, it's for scientific facts. They're opinions. They're individuals' versions of events. They're one person or a few persons' responses to something that's happened. And they can be all sorts of things. Can be your sources. It could be a picture, or it could be a sculpture, like I'm working on now. It could be a marriage certificate. It could be a standing building. It could be a novel, or it could be a rubbish dump, or a prayer, or a grave, or, you know, all sorts of things can be your source. The list is pretty much infinite. And a lot of people now in various ways of studying the past are very keen on being multidisciplinary. So yes, I do archaeology, and I do art history, and I do literature. But no matter how many different approaches we bring, we still can't really know all this stuff intimately, even if we're only looking at a few decades of the past and quite a small geographical area. So how do we, as scholars, make sense of the past? Well, and this is where, you know, the academy, the university comes in. We work by consensus. You know, you publish an article, you wait to see what all your mates think about it. You set up a theory, you set up methodology. You can divide up the study of the past into history, museum studies, archaeology, classics, heritage management. You know, they're all different vectors. You create very complex jargons to discuss your subject. And of course, the more you do that, the more you create a barrier between the past as it's discussed within universities and popular interest. And, you know, nowadays we're very much encouraged to get our work out there and reach a wider public, whether it's liaising with museums or doing festivals, or, you know, one of the things that we do at Nordic Studies is Viking feasts, outreach, impact, you know, very trendy words. But nonetheless, it's hard sometimes to put this across to a wider public, because ultimately a historian's version of the past is always provisional, it's always changing, it's always open to new ideas, hopefully. It's stressing complexity, it's saying there is no simple past out there. What a novelist does in terms of creating a narrative is quite different. Obviously there are exceptions, but typically a novel has a beginning, a middle and an end. It ties up the loose ends. It has a linear narrative. It follows the stories of individuals, and it has this sense of closure. And people like closure. You know, if you pick up a Mills and Boon, you're going to feel really cheated if they don't get together at the end. If you pick up a crime novel, you want a corpse within the first 2 or 3 chapters. If you get to chapter 23 and there still hasn't been a corpse, you know, there's something wrong here. Genre busting. Anyway, so, you know, there are all sorts of rules governing fiction, and I'll give you genre examples there, but, you know, they tend to govern fiction. We might think of exceptions like John Fowles' French Lieutenant's Woman or something like that, where he's playing around with all sorts of expectations. But mostly, this is how a novel works. It's very different from writing academic history. And if over the last few years there is one thing I've learned through certainly bitter and at times quite bloody experience, it's that if you want to write commercially successful fiction, the story has to come first. If the history doesn't make a good story, change the history. Sorry. You know, you're reading a source, a primary source, and it gives you a date, and then there's nothing happens, and then 5 years later something else happens. Tough. You just sort of cut out those 5 years, cram the 2 events together, or make up lots of interesting stuff to go in the middle. If you're writing historical fiction, absolutely immerse yourself in your primary sources, but they're the raw ingredients, they're the list of ingredients for the recipe. Don't wait for a story to come bubbling up out of those primary sources, because it won't. And this is shocking bad practice for a historian, but it's absolutely essential for a novelist. And it does, as you can probably tell, completely do my head in, doing both at the same time. I work in the early Middle Ages, and that's a long time ago, and a lot of stuff doesn't survive. But Christian works in the 18th century, and you know that you do not have a complete record of your comparatively recent past. Even somebody working with the 1950s and 1960s, you know, you don't have access to everything. No human activity is ever fully recorded. And certainly in my period, the material that does survive may not even be reliable for telling us, you know, when a king was born, or which battle came before which, or, you know, you've got two different battles, but they might just be the same battle under different names. And what you end up doing is playing join the dots, you know, these puzzles where you just draw a line between apparently random dots, and you end up, oh, a lovely picture. But, you know, it kind of depends which dots you join, which picture you end up with. And you also forget about the negative spaces. You end up with your lovely picture, and that stops you from seeing the gaps and the absences in your material. And even when, as historians, we have a good grasp of what we're working with, it's very easy to join those dots, to make a picture that looks coherent, and to forget that people are not actually rational, that people do all sorts of really stupid things all the time, and that history happens by accident as much as it happens on purpose. You know, people drink too much, or they misjudge somebody's personality, or, you know, they have a hissy fit, and these things nudge history in a different direction. But a historian 1,000 years later, or 500 years later, or 200 years later, just sees the end result and doesn't see all the mess that's gone into creating that end result. And if you're a historian of emotion or belief, then trying to get inside people's heads fast, it's incredibly difficult. But what you do, if you end up spending a lot of time with your primary sources, is you start getting a feeling for the period, the way people think, the assumptions that they're living their lives by. And quite often, you end up intuiting an awful lot that you can't prove. There's this kind of fuzzy zone. I know it was like that, but I don't have the data. And this is where I think the close relationship between what I do as a novelist and what I do as an academic becomes really, really interesting, really thought-provoking. Because I use the same material to write academic history and to write a novel. And it means that writing the academic history, I can concentrate on the analysis, I can concentrate on what the sources say, because all that kind of fuzzy intuitive stuff can go in the novel, and vice versa. I feel I don't have to do it, and its real peril with historical fiction is what's known in the trade as the info dump. You know, okay, it's a story set in the 13th century about corruption in the wool trade. And there's all sorts of exciting things going on, and skullduggery and bribery and murder and so on. But you need to know about the 13th century wool trade and how it works. So the novelist will give you 3 dense pages of facts about the wool trade. And they need to go and write a historical book about the wool trade and get it all out of their system and then come back to the novel. So trying to get 2 pieces of work on the go that have this symbiotic relationship, you know, they're interconnected, and yet each stands alone. So, to go back to my Dying in Death book, there we go. This is now available in attractively priced paperback, by the way. Only £20, so I think you can get it even cheaper on Amazon. The first study of this the first chapter is a case study of Ethelfled, and I've put her name up there because Anglo-Saxon names are a real problem, and I would discourage anybody from writing historical fiction about the Anglo-Saxons because their names are dreadful. But anyway, Ethelfled, who is a woman, the female ruler of Mercia, as I was saying, the West Midlands of England, in the late 9th and early 10th centuries. And in the opening chapter of this book, I looked at her as a case study of everything we could say about her family, you know, the death of her parents, death of siblings. She led men into battle, the deaths of soldiers who served under her, her anticipation of her own death, her building of a church in Gloucester, her doing a deal with the local bishop for lots of prayers and masses and psalms to be sung around her grave in perpetuity. It's a nice little 10,000 word case study. Absolutely central to Ethelfled of Mercia's plans for her own death in the early 10th century was the figure of Saint Oswald, who was king of Northumbria and died in battle and became a saint. And he had died about 250 years before she lived. And his bones had been buried originally at the site of the battle, and then they'd been dug up and taken to a monastery in Lincolnshire, so right over in eastern England, called Bardney. And that monastery became a really important place of pilgrimage and a monastery of royal burial. We don't know a great deal about it, but it's clearly an important place. And then in the 860s, the east of England, including Lincolnshire, falls into the hands of what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle calls the Great Heathen Army, which we call the Vikings. And, we all have this idea of what happens to a monastery when Vikings come along. But there is no record of what happened to Bardney and the relics, the bones of St. Oswald. So in about 870, Bardney and Lincolnshire fall to the Vikings. 40 years go by with absolutely no historical reference to what happened at Bardney at all. And then, in the first decade of the 10th century, two of the manuscripts of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is our main source for the history of the period, it's written up in a kind of year-by-year flash fiction. It's like Twitter. If you can sum up the important events of a year in 140 characters, that's what the Anglo-Saxon chroniclers are doing. And here it is in Anglo-Saxon, just as a treat for you. Two different manuscripts, the D manuscript and the B manuscript. There is also an A manuscript and a C manuscript, but they don't record this event. Conveniently, under different years, they tell us about the body of St. Oswald. In this year was St. Oswald's body taken from Bardney, it says under 906. In this year, was St. Oswald's body taken from Bardney to Mercia. Okay. They don't tell us anything more. They don't tell us where in Mercia, but the chances are that it is to Ethelfled's new church in Gloucester, which is on the record a little bit later as being St. Oswald's church. And it has been excavated, and it's very plausibly the place where the relics were going to be enshrined in a beautiful tomb as a sort of focus of devotion. Okay. It's a passive sentence. It's in the passive voice. It doesn't tell us anything about who took the body of St. Oswald from Viking Bardney into Ethelfled's Mercia. The Vikings, as far as we know, are pagans. They're worshipping Odin and Thor and boat burials and human sacrifice, all this kind of stuff. Ethelfled's a Christian. What's going on here? There's a story in here somewhere. Anyway, I wrote my chapter. I poked at the question of the bones of St. Oswald from as many different interdisciplinary angles as I possibly could. I went to Bardney, I went to Gloucester, and I concluded that you could say absolutely nothing more with any confidence about this intriguing episode. And then I got thinking, and I specifically got thinking about bones, because this was a book about death and dying and graves and corpses, and this is what I like doing, and I spend time thinking about bones in various contexts and capacities. But I was particularly interested by these bones because of the mystery about them. We don't even know that the Vikings did actually sack the monastery of Bardney. They could have just, kind of moved in and said, okay, now you're paying tax to us instead of whoever. When we read about Vikings taking over monasteries, admittedly, it tends to be things like the Anglo-Saxon writer Alcuin, describing the reign of Lindisfarne in 793, said that the Vikings have laid waste the house of our hope and trampled the bodies of the saints like dung in the street. That's kind of how we think of Vikings attacking monasteries. Adam of Bremen, continental writer, refers to St. Ansgar fleeing the devastation of Hamburg. He says, the saintly Ansgar escaped all but naked with the relics of the holy martyrs. And I have this wonderful vision of, Ansgar, kind of in his knickers, jumping out of the window with the relics in his arms. But we don't know what happened at Bardney. It could have been, as I said, just, a new overlord. It could have been maybe they ravaged the shrine and took any gold and jewels that were lying around but left the bones where they were. Or it could be that somebody like Ansgar fleeing Hamburg had run screaming for his life with the bones clutched to his chest. But then I started thinking, of course, one skeleton looks very much like another skeleton. And why do I even think that these bones were the real bones of St. Oswald? They could have been fakes. Or somebody could have thought they were the bones, but they weren't the real bones. Or maybe, there are con artists and I don't know, I have this vision of, the sort of people who have stalls selling rip-off Gucci and rip-off Chanel and, rip-off saints' bones. Who's to say that this bone is or is not the real bone of a saint? And it started making me think that perhaps more than any other commodity, a saint's bone, the value of it is entirely in the eye of the beholder. Because if you are a devout Catholic Christian, a saint's relic is possibly the single most valuable object conceivable. But if you're not, then maybe, it's a human bone, you treat it with respect, or it could just be something that you chuck to a dog or throw in the bin or, burn. Another complicating factor in all this is that church law 1,000 years ago and today absolutely forbids the sale of saints' relics. They can be given, but they cannot be sold. So if we are thinking, some canny Viking in Lincolnshire is contacting the rulers of Mercia and saying, I've got some really good relics going cheap, or I've got some really good relics, but it'll cost you, and they buy them, then they're breaking canon law. So that kind of makes it all a bit more interesting. And again, we need to think about, Catholic relics. A saint's body is it's part of the saint. It still has, it's a channel to the saint up in heaven. And in the Middle Ages, it was certainly thought that the saint still was kind of present in the relics, and that if a saint was stolen, that could only happen if the saint wanted to go with the thief. And there are other stories about people trying to steal saints' relics and not being able to lift up the casket containing the bones because the saint didn't want to go. And so miraculously the casket became heavy. And so St. Oswald wants to go to Mercia, is one of the things that this story is telling us. So all of this, thinking about all these different aspects to the bones, was like trying to overhear. It's like putting a glass against the wall and trying to overhear conversations that you can't quite pick up. And I started really just messing around and writing out different scenarios and trying to figure out what might have happened. And doing that, I began to realise that I had two of the most important things that you need for a story. And the first of these was the overarching structure. This is a quest. This is like Bilbo and the dwarves going to get the treasure. This is absolutely archetypal quest narrative, handed to me on a plate by the Anglo-Saxon chronicler. Here was Sankt Oswald's lich, ye laird of Bardney on Mercia. That one sentence is the end of my story. All I had to do was figure out how to get to that end. And the second ingredient contained in this sentence is the MacGuffin. I don't know if you've come across MacGuffins, but this is a term for a narrative device. It's not my term. It was popularised by Alfred Hitchcock. But the device, the MacGuffin, is as old as story itself. It's the thing that kicks off a story. So Helen of Troy being kidnapped is a MacGuffin for the Trojan War. The Holy Grail is a MacGuffin. The Maltese Falcon is a MacGuffin. What Hitchcock said was it's the device, the gimmick, if you like. It's the papers the spies are after. It's the secret to the world-destroying device. It doesn't really matter what it is. The only thing that matters is that the readers believe that the MacGuffin is of vital importance to the characters. And St. Oswald's bones have the potential to be an absolutely first-class MacGuffin. Although it did take a bit of a struggle to convince my editor, when I finally got to that stage, that saints' bones were really as important as I was trying to convince her they were. Okay. Thinking about it, I'm not quite sure when I moved from thinking, this would make a great story, this has the ingredients, to going, okay, I'm going to write 100,000 words of novel. But it was somewhere around here. I kind of crossed an internal boundary between what's allowed to a historian and the much fuzzier and more exciting world of making things up. And once I'd done that, I realised that it was really changing the way I thought about history. Because a historian is an outsider. You know, you're looking through the telescope or down the microscope. But a novelist, you've got to get under people's skin, look at events through their eyes. You've got to also, and this is really hard, you've got to forget what happens next. If you're writing a story set in 1938, your characters don't know what happens in 1939, and they certainly don't know what happens in 1945. And you've got to try and get back into that forward-looking mentality. And that's really hard, because you can't forget, but you've got to, but you can't, but you've got to. You've also got to try and stretch your imagination into a different shape and have sympathy for things that you might really find difficult. And, you know, for the 10th century, slavery is something that people take for granted. The death penalty, forced marriage. You know, none of these are issues which have gone away, but they're certainly not issues which, on the whole, in Western society, we find easy to think about or comfortable. And trying to get back into a world where these are things which are challenges that people take for granted as part of their daily routine is quite hard work. But nonetheless, it's really useful. And I would think that really anybody who's thinking about past cultures, whether it's their literature or their history or their archaeology, should try and do this. Just as a training exercise, even if you're just writing 150-word kind of flash fiction, just trying to get into that mentality. And it also made me think really hard about why I was interested in particular aspects of history and why other bits really turned me off. Military history, oh God, you know, battles and charging around, and no. But you've got to be completely all-embracing in your attitude to the past and think about things like, I don't know, did they have saddlebags in the 10th century? My character has to get from Gloucester to Lincoln. How's he going to get there? On a horse. Okay, what sort of horses did they have? What sort of saddles did they have? What sort of saddlebags? Where's he going to keep his packed lunch? If we don't know, well, what do we know? And asking these kind of micro questions, which had simply never occurred to me in years and years and years of studying this culture. But my big problem still was I didn't have a main character. And some of my readers have said, well, why not Ethelfled? I mean, here you've got this really cool woman, and why not make her the heroine of the novel? And I didn't. She's a minor character. She's not a major character. And thinking about it, I think I had two main problems. And one was that writing about real people, I had this slight squeamishness about messing about too much with real people. I couldn't write a novel about Anne Boleyn. Every historical novelist has to write a novel about Anne Boleyn at some point, but I couldn't. Because she was a real person, and I don't want to mess about with her life to make a better story. It also seemed to me that Ethelfled of Mercia had a great deal to do without being made to go undercover, running around in Lincolnshire looking for some bones, and I could get somebody else to do that instead. I wanted somebody, a hero, who could travel freely. And in the 10th century, that certainly makes it easier to choose a man. I wanted somebody who would understand why the bones were important, and somebody who would have a good chance of recognising a real saint's bone rather than a fake saint's bone, if you can. So I thought, I need a man, I need somebody in Ethelfled's inner circle, and I need a cleric. And I came up with a very sweet young man. He's 24. He's a minor cleric. He's Ethelfled's secretary, and he is my bridge character. Now, this is another convention of historical fiction. It's quite tricky. It's somebody who is a bridge between the reader in the modern world and the alien culture of the past. Somebody who kind of mediates the weird things about that culture and makes sense of them for the reader. And it's quite difficult because I wanted a bridge character who would appeal to the reader. You've got to like somebody if you're going to spend time in their company. But I also didn't want just to make him, you know, a kind of modern, feminist, liberal, egalitarian kind of guy. And so what I did was I looked in 10th and 11th century sources for stuff which we would get, and built my character around these ideas. So, for example, the Archbishop of York, in around the year 1000, wrote a really passionate argument against the death penalty. Admittedly, he was arguing for chopping people's hands and noses off instead, but it was against the death penalty, and he was saying that men should not be executed for small crimes, and pleading with judges that they shouldn't throw away God's own handiwork. And I just thought this was a lovely phrase, and I used that kind of as a central structuring thing for my main character. Poor Wolfgar, poor dear Wolfgar, he really tries to live by the gospel. He looks for the good in everybody. He tries to love his neighbour as himself, but he doesn't love himself very much, which is a bit of a problem. He looks for the good in men, women, adults, children, slaves, free, Christians, pagans. He gets into awful trouble. He's out of his depth a lot of the time. He makes an idiot of himself over the course of both stories, because Traitor's Pit is the sequel to Bone Thief. He has his faith tested quite seriously, and he grows up a bit. And I do hope to go back and write Wolfgar 3 one of these days. He doesn't appeal to everybody. One of my Amazon reviewers calls him a hero who could dither for England. And somebody else emailed me through my website to say, I can't stand him, he's so feeble. And by the end of the story, she wanted the thugs with swords to win instead. That was her phrase, thugs with swords. You know, you can't please everybody. And then we get on to a heroine. And this is a whole new challenging landscape because, of course, a modern readership wants strong female characters. Actually, I think a medieval readership probably wanted strong female characters as well, but it's a more challenging thing to construct. However, we do have Ethelfled. Ethelfled rules Mercia on her own, first while her husband is ill, and then for 7 years after he dies. And that's as good history as we know. That really happened. She builds fortified sites, she commands armies, she wins battles, and there's no indication in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that this is odd. And then when she dies, her daughter takes over in Mercia and rules for 6 months. And it's only after she's been on the throne between the summer and Christmas of 918 that her wicked Uncle Edward, who is King of Wessex, moves in, takes her out, and takes over Mercia. And the fact that a woman can succeed a woman is really interesting. And that does suggest that maybe in Mercia, at least, women are not only at home looking after the babies. But these are the two most powerful women in their culture, and they don't really give me a license to people my pages with feisty young women who can choose their career and choose their husbands and all the rest of it. An exceptional woman, I think, needs an exceptional context. And what I came up with for my heroine is, I don't know, Wolfgar there was a protagonist-shaped hole in the story, and Wolfgar sort of took shape in that hole. Gunvor Cat's Eyes just rode into the story. She threw back her hood, and there she was, complete. She's the daughter of a Norwegian warlord, part of the Great Heathen Army, Viking Army. She grew up as a camp follower in this kind of hard scrabble, moving around after the army, never a chance to learn the traditional female skills of weaving and baking and housekeeping. But her father is a warlord. He's got loot, if not land. By 900, when my story starts, her father is dead, but she's still very much looked after by his old brothers in arms. She has been married to one of them, but he's dead too. So she's a widow, which gives you much more autonomy than being unmarried or a wife. She has a wide network of contacts. She has a sharp tongue. She has an even sharper knife. She has a very sharp dress sense. And she is the only person who knows where her father's stash of silver is buried, which gives her a bargaining tool. Anyway, it took me a long time to bash the story into shape, and it took me a long time to find an agent, and then it took me a long time to find a publisher. And then I got a 2-book contract with Ebury, and that was great, but I then had to deal with my editor. And my editor's background was in Mills and Boon, and overseeing the UK publication of those sparkly Twilight vampires, Stephanie Myers. And then one of her other projects at the time she signed me on was reviving the Black Lace Erotica for Women imprint. and trying to find the new 50 Shades of Grey and all this kind of thing. So she and I didn't really see eye to eye about a lot of things. I've told you we had a row about the cover art for book 2. We had rows about my name. I'm VM Whitworth because she said I couldn't be Victoria because men don't buy books, even if they're about men with swords, by people called Victoria. Or female names in general. It's not just a particular prejudice against Victorias. But women will buy books by men, but men will not buy books by women. No. We can all think of honourable exceptions to this, but this is a kind of publishing truism. So, so I'm gender neutral. There was nothing compared to the battle, however, when she found out that my second book had trial by ordeal at the centre of it. Trial by ordeal was at the centre of European justice for about 400 years, and it's basically a kind of lie detector test. The idea is that if there is no witness to a crime and you deny that you've done it, but the circumstantial evidence that you've done it is very strong, instead of being hooked up to a polygraph, you have to put your hand into a pot of boiling water and pull out a stone, or you have to pick up an iron bar that's been heated to red hot, and then your hand is bandaged, and then after 3 days it's examined, and if it's healing well, you're innocent, and if it's festering, you're guilty. Well, it sounds, and this is very much Gillian's reaction, my editor's reaction, but a lot of work has been done around it, about the ways in which, if you are guilty, the psychosomatic effect of knowing that you're guilty and anxiety that you are going to be exposed through this test can affect the rate at which your body heals. And also the ways in which, and it's administered by the church, it's not administered by the state hands you over to the church, and there seem to be a lot of ways in which during those 3 days the bishop and the clergyman who are looking after you come to their own conclusions from your behaviour about your guilt and innocence. So there's quite a lot of wriggle room in there. It's more sophisticated than it sounds. And I wanted trial by ordeal because there is this fantastic late 10th century law which says found guilty, hanged, and buried out of consecrated ground with the idea that his soul will be damned. His family believe that there's been a miscarriage of justice and he is in fact innocent. A member of the family is then entitled to undergo the trial by ordeal on behalf of the dead relative, with the hope of then getting his body exhumed and reburied in a churchyard in consecrated ground. So although it's too late to save his life, you can still save his soul. Now this is amazing. This just opens up all sorts of questions about family relationships. I mean, would you do that for somebody who is dead? Identity, the living man's guilt and innocence being mapped onto that of the corpse, and loyalty and courage and faith and the changing landscape, because this is a period when the very idea of the churchyard being a consecrated place is coming into existence in the first time. And I thought, fantastic, I'm going to write this story. And stroppy emails back and forth with my editor saying, but surely no one ever believed in this rubbish. And me saying, it was at the heart of European justice for 400 years. And her saying, but it's patently nonsense. And me saying, well, what about lie detector tests? And her saying, well, how about you have this in your story, but Wolfgar doesn't believe in it. This is the bridge character thing again. And me going, no, because Wolfgar is the character who's going to stand up and say, I will take the test on behalf of my dead kinsman. Plot spoiler, sorry. Anyway, I won in the end. Then she wanted Wolfgar and Gunvar to just fall into bed together, and that seemed to me inappropriate because their relationship is quite complex and slow developing, and I want to write 7 books in this series. And I don't know, I mean, here's a woman who is overseeing an erotica imprint, and she should know that sexual tension is one of the most powerful drivers of narrative, the whole will they, won't they thing. And if they fall into bed in book 2, then, well, never mind, anyway. I won, not spoiler. But it was painful and it was protracted, and it brought home to me as nothing else the difficulty of turning that kind of academic awareness of the past into a commercial narrative. But if I could convince Gillian, who is a real high-octane Metropolitan Party girl, if I could convince her that my story and my characters worked, I felt I could convince almost everyone. I will never convince everyone. I've told you about a couple of my critics already, but I do get a steady trickle of fan mail through my website, which makes it clear that my research, my understanding of the significance of the body of St. Oswald for the politics of Mercia, or my understanding of the role of trial by ordeal in the exoneration of an executed criminal, this is reaching an audience that's not just the professional historians and archaeologists who will read my academic work. It's reaching, the tour guides of Winchester Cathedral, a retired lady in Yorkshire who loves my horses. She emailed me to say, "This is so wonderful, a story that doesn't treat the horses as if they were motorbikes." Because you can't get off a horse and just walk away. You've got to get off the horse and look after the horse and then walk away. She's very anxious about the horses. Is Wolfgar going to get reunited with Fallow in a future? Anyway, Mick, the van driver, who drives up and down England all day in his professional life and had never realised that the modern roads, like the A5, are actually the Roman roads that are so central to the journeys of my characters. Anyway, it should be clear by now that this is a project which has given me a huge amount of pleasure and much intellectual stimulation, but also a few anxieties. It's bad enough writing academic work for other academics. It feels like stripping your clothes off before a potentially hostile gaze, let's face it. Taking that research and sensationalising it, turning it into character and plot, making it exciting enough to keep a reader who doesn't have to write an essay turning the pages, not only gives you that nightmare sense of, oh God, I'm naked in public, but also you start thinking my academic colleagues are going to find out about this and they'll go, oh, we knew she was just making it all up all along, and that your entire reputation will just crumble. Okay. But it hasn't. People have been really interested, which is, kind of why I'm here, about the extent to which you can bring together the historical fiction side of things and the academic research side of things, and the ways in which the two can coexist. And I would really like, it sounds really ambitious, but I would really like to move historical fiction on as a genre. I think somebody like Hilary Mantel is doing it, but she annoys me, and Philippa Gregory annoys me, and I shouldn't be saying this live on camera, because it will get back to them. But they claim that what they're doing is research. It's not, it's fiction. They're making it up, they're making a story, they're changing history for their own purposes, and that is something no respectable historian will ever do. But I would like to see historical fiction coming full circle. And I just want to say a word or two about where historical fiction started and where it might go back to. It became established in the English-speaking world as a genre, really very much thanks to Sir Walter Scott. And Scott's historical novels are vehicles of ideas, whether it's Ivanhoe, where he's dramatising the 12th century, or Red Gauntlet, where he's not only inventing the historical novel, but inventing the counterfactual historical novel, which is really cool. This sort of fictional 18th century Third Jacobite rebellion in Red Gauntlet. But these novels, they're not concerned with the minutiae of accuracy. Scott really doesn't care if in the 18th century the panniers are being worn 18 inches or 2 feet wide in a particular year. He so doesn't care about that kind of anal obsessive detail. What he's interested in are the resonances of past and present. He's interested in constructing history as a myth for the present and the future to take forward. He's interested in stories about the Union. He's a passionate unionist, and Scotland has only quite recently been integrated into the United Kingdom. He's interested in reconciliation, bringing these things together. And Scott's novels were seen at the time as really solid, demanding, chewy stuff, and they are explicitly aimed at an educated, adult, masculine readership, very much like Scott himself. And then in the middle of the 19th century, things change, and the historical novel goes down market, and it becomes sensational and suitable for young ladies. or educational and suitable for children. And it's never really got out of that bracketing as being either, bodice ripper or the sugar-coated educational motif. And I would really like to see historical novels that are really thinking about history and what history means and what we can do with history and move it all on. What both historians and novelists have in common is that you can't get it right. There is no right. My 10th century, no matter what book I'm writing, isn't anybody else's 10th century. And there is no such thing as a historical fact. And on that note, I'm going to stop. Thank you. Just in time.
Just in time. We've got 8 minutes before they present the history class that follows. Questions? Thoughts?
Creaky table.
About language, which I if you are taking contemporary novel, you know now how people speak.
Yeah.
The slang, the terminology.
Yeah.
You're writing back at 909. So in your prose, when you're describing or chapter headings, that would be, I imagine, modern prose.
Mm.
But when you characters speak, what do you do with the language then? Do you try and make them speak like they would have done Anglo-Saxon?
Well, obviously I can't. I can't, although there is a bizarre novel called The Wake around at the moment, which was on the book along list, which is written in a kind of pseudo Old English. And it was crowdfunded for publication because no publisher would touch it. And it's, people got really excited about this, inventive English. And that's made me think I missed an opportunity there because I could have done that. But as you can see, I cannot write a novel in Old English that people really are going to want to read. What I can try and do is also, I'm writing in a very multicultural environment because people are speaking, the churchmen are speaking Latin as well as their native Old English, which is what this is. The Vikings are speaking Old Norse, the ancestor of modern Norwegian and so on. Is to try and just foreground a little bit, put in just a few little bits of Latin and Old Norse to try and indicate what somebody is saying and have them translated by context. To try and avoid anachronism. You don't want to say, oh, he's run out of steam or something. It's so hard. It's really hard to try and get all those metaphors out. It's also quite hard to think of metaphors to replace it. You don't want to end up, and it is easy to do, writing a very flat language that avoids all the rich modern slang, avoids all those metaphors like run out of steam, but also avoids anachronisms, because you don't want people saying gadzooks and stuff. I mean, Walter Scott does. He has this kind of cod medieval that you have to be really into, I think, to read nowadays, because it is quite hard work. But I don't think I've got it right yet. I think there are places where my characters are too colloquial. I'm not sure, again, you can get it right, but it's something to try and be alive to try and find a voice that convinces without getting bogged down.
Anyone on Jeffrey? I'm seeing Archie pop up. I'm not sure if he's... Sorry, put me on the spot there.
Has Archie got a question, Jim?
If he hasn't, can I just ask you about the other thing you said was you don't know what size the sandbags are.
Yeah.
Did you ever use pictures as a source for seeing what 18th century photograph? But that time there would still be artworks. Did you look at those to get an idea what the horses looked like?
Well, I mean, I am, basically these days I am an art historian. So yes, I'm very, very alive to the visual. But the trouble is that most medieval art is not somebody. It's not photography. It's not documentary. Art has its own language and its own traditions. So if somebody is drawing, chances are they're drawing. I mean, most art is religious art. So you might have an image of a biblical scene, like the sacrifice of Isaac, with Abraham and Isaac and a donkey with stuff on its back going up a hill. But the chances are that that's based on an earlier image, which might be, an ivory carving or a piece of metal work that might have come from Italy or from Ireland. and trying to pick out what the contemporary details. A lot of it is trying to find out what we know and where the gaps are and what's possible within the gaps. So, would he have had panniers, or would he have had a kind of satchel-y saddlebag, or would he have had, did he travel with like a sleeping mat, and would that have been made of straw, or would it have been made of felt, or just trying to work out what the possibilities are. Would he have had that rolled up and strapped to the back of the saddle, and try and come up with something that's not impossible. You see what I mean? Even if there's no direct evidence for it.
Well, Samson, so his name writes about that period, doesn't he? Dominion.
That's 16th century.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's lovely.
Yes, so it's Reformation.
Yes.
Yes. Silence.
Don't let me pipe up again. Alright. Have you been to something called St. Whitworth? She was born in Deer, where I come from, we have that in common. And a miraculous saint, there's a well in our parish church, which is part of the miracle. But she was stolen. You talked about saints being stolen, and they had to give their permission. Well, she gave permission to the monks of Ely, who stole her by night, took her off to Ely. But monks of Deer went and stole her back another time. Somebody if you've ever come across that story.
I don't think I have. No. Well, she must have not liked Ely and wanted to go back again.
I'll do it when we set something up. Is anybody else like you writing about this period?
Yeah, in fact, Bernard Cornwell, and I have not read, has a series set around exactly the same historical period, but much more focused on the real historical characters, because my characters kind of emerge out of the gaps and move around the people about whom we know quite a lot. So he's less squeamish than I am. I just have this feeling that one day I will die, and I hope I will go to heaven, and there I will meet Ethelfled of Mercia, and she will have words with me if I take too many liberties with her reputation. So yeah, I'm cautious.
So when you're writing your essays, there's something that bothers you can't quite figure out, don't put it in your essays. Save it for the dissertation.
Yeah, have a save it for the novel file.
I feel we'll have to run away with this.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Say goodbye to the VC.